Okay, welcome to one more class of Enterprise Application Integration. So today we are going to start to talk about middleware. Some of the things that we'll see, you already covered, at least some of you in the distributed systems class. Some of the things that we'll see actually haven't covered in the distributed systems class, so that will be interesting information. So let's start to talk a little bit about transactions, because transactions are really one of those things that you need to have in any kind of enterprise systems. So imagine that you have a client and you have a network and you have a database, and in your client application you are doing something like transfer 1 million euros from bank account A to bank account B. Okay? Of course, if you implement this in a very naive way, you could write something like this. Imagine account 1 remove money from there, and if you are able to remove the money, you get a boolean saying, okay, you've got the money in your application. And then on account 2, you'd call a method that would deposit the money. In this case, 1 million euros. Of course, this is very naive, but actually some people could actually think of implementing this in this way. And it creates a slight problem. So imagine that your application actually crashes on line 2. So you've taken the money out of the first bank account, the application crashes. When it restarts, well, there's nothing there, right? Imagine that actually the connection is lost while you are at line 4. So you actually call account to deposit, and that invocation might have succeeded or not. And imagine that it's actually not the network, not even the client, but actually the server that crashes. And the server crashes between the time that you took the money and you are checking what's going on. So you have problems in terms of reliability both on the client side and on the server side. And as you know, this was actually solved by someone called Jim Gray, who was a very important person in the world of computer science and database systems. And he invented a concept called transactions. And the idea of a transaction is that you actually have a programming model that makes it a lot easier to develop systems that have to have reliability concerns, that cannot crash, and if they crash, you are actually able to put the system in a consistent state. Okay? So overall, if you think about databases and the reason why you use databases in general, there are several reasons for doing that. One of the reasons is that you actually want to separate the business logic from actually the data management part and be able to have efficiency and performance while assessing the data, while at the same time keep the code that actually manages your business separated from there. But also another important point is not just a question of performance, is actually the assurances that databases give you regarding data. So the idea is that if your application or if your database crashes, somehow it has the mechanisms necessary to recover. One of the key concepts is then the concept of transaction. And as you know, when you have a transaction is a set of activities, is a set of operations that as a whole, either it completes fully or what happens is that it's like it never happened. So imagine you have operation 1, operation 2, operation 3. If you have a transaction and you say begin transaction, do operation 1, 2, and 3, end transaction, either the complete set of operations actually finishes and it's well succeeded, or basically the system and the application server is able to roll back and it's like you never invoked this set of operations and nothing happened. For doing this, what happens is that databases implement two types of techniques. One of the techniques is what's called the redo and undo log. Basically, every time you do something in a database, it records in a log the operation that you are about to make, the state of the data before you make the operation, then it tries to make the operation, and then it goes to the log and registers if it was succeeded or not, and updates the corresponding data structures. What this means is that if you actually crash while you are changing the data structures, you can go to the log and see what was there before, and you can undo. And you can also recover forward in some cases. Another technique that some systems use is called shadowing. In shadowing, what you do is not to use a log, but actually you create a copy of the data there. So imagine that you are performing an operation where you are depositing a certain amount of money into an account. What would happen was that you'd create a copy of that record, you'd update it, and when you commit it, basically you put the copy there, or vice versa. If you crash meanwhile, basically this thing is deleted and is like it has never happened. Again, this is a little bit more complicated to do than just this small description. Nowadays, almost all systems use redo and undo logs and not really shadowing, mostly because of performance reasons. But these are the two main ideas in terms of implementation. So let's look at the transaction, not from strictly from a database point of view, but actually from a programming model point of view. So imagine that you are actually implementing the business logic for a business transaction like the one I was showing you. What you do when you develop code for this thing is actually to ask a transaction. So you have an operation that allows you to start a transaction, and basically you do everything that you need. For instance, remove a certain amount of money from an account, putting money in a different account. And when you want to commit, basically you call a method that allows you to commit the transaction. And basically, if the commit is well succeeded, basically the changes are permanent. If by any chance you need to roll back, or there was a problem, imagine there is not enough money in the account or something like that, if you roll back the transaction, basically you get to the initial state. So it's like nothing has happened before. One important point regarding transactions is that while you are inside the transaction, the changes that you are making, for instance, taking money out of an account, putting money in a different account, are not visible to the outside world. Again, you have isolation. It's like you are in your own world, and when you do a commit, everything becomes visible immediately. The complete set of operations regarding several intervenients in the transaction. So, again, this is a recap. In general, there are 4 characteristics associated to transactions. They are called ACID transactions. And ACID means atomic. Atomic, the meaning of this is that if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 operations that are protected by a transaction, either the 4 operations complete as a whole, or the 4 operations are rolled back and no changes occurred. Okay, it's everything or nothing kind of approach. Okay, so going back to our example, if the transaction is succeeds, it's like these 2 operations are instantaneously, and the money is removed from the first account and put on the second account immediately when you actually have the commit. If basically it fails, imagine that you remove the money. Removing the money is not visible to the outside world, Imagine that you have an exception and it's rolled back. Basically, it never happened. Okay? So the second characteristic is called consistent. While Atomic can be implemented exclusively by the middleware, having the support to do that, consistency cannot be implemented without the help of the programmer. And the consistent transaction is a transaction that moves your system from a valid state to a valid state without violating invariance. So imagine the following. You have two bank accounts, right, which have money. So let's imagine that the total amount of money in the account 1 and account 2 is 2 million euros, okay? So imagine that you remove 1 million euros from this account and you only deposit, let's say, 900,000 euros. What happens? Basically, there are 100,000 euros that are lost, okay? That's not consistent. Why? Because the sum of all money involved should be a constant between transactions, okay? You cannot create money and you cannot lose money. You have to move the system from valid state to valid state. The third characteristic is that is called isolation. And what isolation means is that whenever you are doing operations, whenever you are doing transactions, the transactions and the changes are not visible to the outside world. Notice that this is different from being atomic. Atomic means that when a transaction is committed, either everything completed or nothing completed. Isolated means that the intermediate steps of a transaction are not visible. So, for instance, if you go back to this example, the transaction is isolated if the outside world cannot see the bank account of the first account changing until you have the commit. Okay? So imagine from the remove line to the deposit line, this takes, let's say, a day. In that case, the account of the first person will still be showing the balance before the start of the transaction. Okay? It's isolated. You cannot see it from the outside world. The final characteristic of transactions is what's called durability. Transactions are durable. What this means is that once a transaction is committed, you cannot go back. Basically, the changes are permanent and are saved in something called stable storage. Okay? Stable storage is a very, very important concept in enterprise systems and also in distributed systems and in fault tolerance. A stable storage is basically a piece of hardware, a storage device, which, according to a certain failure model, basically all the writes and reads are atomic. What this means, and this is really important for you to understand, is that whenever you design a system, you have also to design a failure model for the system. What this means is that you are going to say explicitly, I assume that my system fails in a certain way. And if you want to have a stable storage device, basically you have to put fault tolerance mechanisms in place that say, if the system fails in this way, I'm able to tolerate that failure. Let me give you an example. Do you think a disk is stable storage or not? A normal disk like this one, the one I have on my laptop. Yes and no. Why yes? Can you?
Well, if you write in the disk and you save, unless your computer burns or something, you expect it to be there. So
Okay, can you press?
Okay, you can write the things to the disk, but if the disk is damaged itself, we lost everything.
Okay, this is really important. There is no correct answer to the question I asked unless you specify a failure mode. Why? Because if I say explicitly, my disk doesn't crash or gets broken, then it's stable storage. Why? Because every read and write to the disk can be seen as atomic. If I assume that this can malfunction, and this is my failure model, basically you cannot say that the changes are durable. Why? Because if I basically crash the disk, you cannot read from it, correct? Now let me ask you something. A RAID system. Let's imagine that you have 5 disks in a RAID 5 configuration. Is that stable storage?
It's the same. Depends.
That's right. It depends. You cannot say that a RAID system is stable storage. Okay? Why? Because a RAID system, a RAID 5 system can only tolerate one disk failure, right? So, if your failure model says that 2 disks can failure at the same time, it's not stable storage. Okay? So you always have to define the failure model. Let's say that I have a RAID system that is RAID 1 plus 5. I think that one allows you to actually tolerate 2 disk failures. Is that stable storage? Not necessarily. It depends on the failure model. Let's say that actually the whole RAID system burns. That can happen. Basically, if your failure model doesn't say that, says that there can be fires in the building, you have to take that into account. And in that case, what happens is that to have stable storage, you'd need to have, let's say, replication to a distant site. Okay? So stable storage, in a nutshell, is a storage device that, according to a certain failure model, doesn't crash. All the writes and reads are atomic. Okay? And saying that the transaction is durable means that it never goes back because you actually write the results in some kind of stable storage. Okay? This is quite an important concept. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to discuss implementation of transactions. Again, this is something that some of you probably have seen ad nauseum in the distributed systems course or in the database course. There are plenty of books about this. You can look up the kind of implementations and concerns that people have in the Coloris book. You can look at the database management systems book. There are 3 chapters just on all the details regarding the implementation of transactions. Okay? What we are going to talk about is actually distributed transactions, because we are dealing with large-scale systems and enterprise-based systems. And if you remember the class about web services and WS transaction, I had the scenario where basically you were transferring some money between 2 different accounts, an account that was in CGD and an account that was in a different bank called MG. So the question is that if you have an application server and you give this order, what happens is that the application server is going somehow to the application server goes somehow to this database server, takes the money out of database record, right? And it says, okay, deposit the money on this one, okay? And basically this one will send the money to the final one. again, you cannot solve this problem with simple database transactions that just go to a database and either put or take things out of the database. Why? Because imagine that the first application server actually crashes. Well, the money may be nowhere because it's actually, let's say, in the state in memory in your code. And you need to have ways to deal with this. For solving these kind of problems, you actually need distributed transactions. A distributed transaction is a transaction for a set of operations that involve multiple parties. And either all parties agree on the result of the transaction and commit, or basically you have to roll back the transaction and it's like none of the parties was involved in that. Does everyone understand the concept of a distributed transaction? Okay? Okay. There are two main types of distributed transactions. There's what's called flat transactions, which are a lot easier to implement and don't give you so much trouble as nested transactions. Flat transactions are basically transactions where you have an initiator, a client, and basically all the resources that are involved are at the same level. So you call machine A, B, C, and D, and there are no other parties involved. A nested transaction is a transaction which can actually open sub-transactions to different machines. Okay? And in general, nested transactions are a lot harder to manage and implement. Why? Because, for instance, if you create cycles and things like that, transactions can get messy really, really quickly. Okay. Key concepts. When you are doing distributed transactions and you have a set of machines involved in a distributed transaction, the protocol that you are using is called the two-phase commit protocol. There's another protocol that is less used called three-phase commit, which actually gives you more guarantees. But again, that's not a topic for discussion today. The standard protocol that everyone implements is called two-phase commit, 2PC. It's normally the abbreviation. For implementing a two-phase commit protocol, there's always a coordinator. And the coordinator is basically a node, a machine, to which one every single machine talks to coordinate the process. Basically, you have a client, and the client is the one that initiates the transaction, and the client is going to ask the coordinator for a transaction ID and to maintain information on behalf of all the participants of the transaction. When the client has performed all the invocations and all the operations that it wants, basically it will ask the coordinator to commit the transaction. And the coordinator will talk with the different participants, asking them if they can commit or if they want to abort. If every participant can actually commit the changes and is ready, it signals, I'm ready to commit. If any of them actually signals, I want to abort the transaction by whatever reason, I don't have money or some kind of locking on a resource has failed, basically the complete transaction has to be aborted. Okay?
What about if a participant doesn't say anything?
Okay, we'll talk about that. Basically, it depends on the phase of the protocol. So there is a state machine associated to this protocol. If a participant doesn't answer in a certain time window, basically, in some occasions, the transaction is rolled back. But there are critical periods that if it doesn't answer, the protocol blocks forever until it answers. Okay? But actually, that's an unsolvable problem, and I can discuss that in a moment. Okay, let's start to look at at the two-phase commit from an external point of view. And what I mean by an external point of view is by looking at the machines and the intervenience associated to it. Then I'm going to talk about the protocol. Okay, so imagine that I'm the client. The first thing that the client does when he wants a transaction is to call a method on the coordinator which has a name like begin transaction. You can actually do this in JBoss and any J2EE server, and probably you've seen code like this. So when you do this, actually the client calls the coordinator, tells him begin transaction, and basically the coordinator creates a new transaction and an ID for this transaction. So let's say that now the client is invoking a method on the first machine, machine A, to withdraw a certain amount of money. So what happens when he calls this is actually the ID of the transaction is sent along. So I do a withdraw. This guy actually has a transaction going on which is not visible to the outside world and starts to make the modifications. For instance, taking, in this case, 10K from a certain account. Okay? When the client is actually contacted for the first time with a transaction ID, it goes to the coordinator and it basically joins the transaction. Okay? So the coordinator knows everybody who is involved. Let's say that I now call b.deposit. Again, b basically joins the transaction and does the changes. And c called deposit. C basically joins the transaction with the coordinator and does the changes. Finally, when I do a commit, what's going to happen is that there's a piece missing. Basically, when I do a commit, the coordinator will invoke the two-phase commit protocol on all the clients. Okay? So let's look at the two-phase commit protocol. So when the client asks, let's commit this, what happens is that the protocol is divided in two phases. And in the first phase, you know that the coordinator has a list of all the participants in the transaction. So the coordinator sends a message to all the participants saying, can you commit? Are you ready? Okay? So imagine, these guys temporarily had taken out 5K from each account and are ready to commit. So each one of the participants can either answer with, yes, I'm ready to commit, or no, I'm unable to commit. If one of them actually has crashed, basically, they can also let a timeout expire or it can abort. The second phase of the protocol actually starts when all the participants answered yes. Again, if one of them answered no, or basically a timeout occurred, the transaction will roll back. It's like it never happened. And the coordinator will inform every single one of them that they have to abort. Let's assume that everyone answered yes. If everyone answered yes, basically the coordinator is going to send a commit message to every participant. So imagine I told you, can you commit? Are you ready to commit? Are you ready to commit? Are you ready to commit? And you said, yes, yes, yes. I know all this, I've stored all this, and now I tell you, commit, commit, commit. And basically you have to confirm back. Okay? As I told you, if some of them answered no or a timeout occur, basically the coordinator has to send an abort to every one of them. Abort, abort, abort. One important point Once every participant answered yes, you cannot go back. Okay? So the transaction will always commit once everyone has answered yes. Okay?
But that may create a problem. If a participant answers yes and then crashes.
The protocol takes care of that. I will show you how. Okay? One important point, and this has to do with your question. If you are using a two-phase commit protocol in an application server and with databases and so on, the protocol assumes that you have stable storage associated to each one of the machines. This means that in all the phases of this protocol, the messages are logged into stable storage, and basically if one of them crashes, it's able to go to stable storage and see in what phase of the protocol it was executing and start from there. Okay? And this is quite an important assumption. So it looks a little bit like this. Imagine that you have a coordinator and two participants. In the first phase, the coordinator sends a can't commit message to each one of them, to which they answer. Let's assume that they answer yes. If these two answers have reached the coordinator, basically the coordinator, this cannot go back. So the coordinator will send commits to each one of them, and they will have to acknowledge. Again, let's assume that the yes of one of the participants, I hate this. Let's assume that this message actually didn't arrive, or this guy crashes permanently, okay? What happens is that there will be a timeout at the coordinator that measures that waits for this answer, and if you have a timeout, the coordinator later on will send an abort to the other guys involved, in this case, participant A. Let's assume that they answer yes, like Carlos was saying, but it crashes after the yes. Every single message that the coordinator receives, again, it's logged in stable storage. So when the coordinator wakes up again, it goes to stable storage and it says, I'm executing in this phase of the protocol. What's missing? In this case, what was missing was the sending of the commit messages. Okay? And in that case, the coordinator will send the commit messages. Okay? A very important assumption is that you have stable storage, both at the coordinator and participants. So we are not going to examine this in much detail, but to actually implement this, there's a complicated... This is not a complete picture, actually. There's a complicated state machine that everyone that implements this protocol has to follow. For instance, if you are the coordinator and you are in the initial state, the first thing that you have to do is to write to stable storage, I'm starting a transaction. And after you've actually written to stable storage, again, it cannot go back. You have the assurance that it was written. You do a begin commit. And when you do a begin commit at the coordinator, basically you send a prepare message to each one of the participants. Again, let's assume that this guy crashes at this time. If this guy crashes, it wakes up. It knows in which state of the transaction it is, because it was in stable storage, and sends the messages again. Okay? Let's assume that, for instance, this guy, everyone answers yes, everyone voted commit, but one of the guys crashes. Okay? And let's assume the coordinator also crashes. So the coordinator will wake up and see, oh, they have all voted committed, so there was no abort. I'm going to lock commit, and then I'm going to send a global commit. And the guys, because they haven't answered yet, will be waiting at the correct state, and so on and so forth. So the protocol is designed so that with the help of stable storage, you are able to commit transactions. Of course, this doesn't always work. One important thing that you have to realize is that the two-phase commit protocol is blocking, okay? So it has to wait for things to happen. And in fact, this protocol can block forever. So the system can basically stop forever in two circumstances. If the coordinator fails permanently, well, you don't have a coordinator, it's crashed forever. The participants can either abort or commit. They are stuck, okay? Because they critically depend on the coordinator. Another problem is that the protocol can block forever if a participant doesn't answer after a commit order. So imagine that after I've sent the commit, this guy never answers back. I told you that once they all have actually answered that they are willing to commit and the coordinator assumes that, well, you need to have the assurance that it committed. So you will keep on sending commit messages until you finally get an OK message. Again, if this guy doesn't recover ever, you will have to keep on sending the messages forever. What's the failure model between these two-phase commit protocol? So, before we go into that, first thing, these are the two main problems with the protocol itself. It can block forever in these two circumstances. Okay? But again, has anything that has to have reliability? If you are designing a reliable system, you have to have a failure model associated to that. And in this case, the failure model is that you don't have Byzantine failures. Does any of you know what a Byzantine failure is? Anyone? Guys at CMU? Press the button.
I think it's like when a guy sends a messenger to another party that is somewhere, and they are afraid that the messenger is captured by the enemy, and they send two.
It's not exactly that. There's a related problem to that, but that's not exactly that. So, do you know the story of the generals in Byzantium? Okay. So these generals, and the name comes from here, were these guys that basically they were loyal to no one. So they would do anything in their own best interest. So Byzantine failure is when you don't have any assumptions or almost any assumptions regarding the way the systems failure. In particular, you may have nodes which are not consistent. What this means is that if you look at this diagram, I'm saying that the coordinator will send a commit message to every one of the participants. Imagine that you have actually a coordinator that is malfunctioning and sends commit to one of the participants and abort to a different participant. The system doesn't work, right? Basically, you have a coordinator who is a liar. It's giving inconsistent information across the nodes. And this can actually happen, right? For instance, if you have a cosmic ray, imagine that the commit message is a single bit in a message, and you have a high energy ray that goes into the network and creates a bit flip, okay? It changes 0 to 1, right? Basically, if you have something like that, actually a commit message can be transformed in an abort message, okay?
What's the probability of that?
Very high, actually. Very, very high. Actually, cosmic rays, believe it or not, are a source of quite a lot bit flips in computer chips nowadays, and even networks. And if you look at the processors, this is a little bit off topic, but it's interesting. what happens nowadays is that the transistors are so small, that even not very high energy rays, and you have radiation all around you, are able to create bit flips. So what happens is that all the electronic circuits nowadays are designed with redundancy. So in general, you have checksums and you have error correcting codes. For instance, let me give you an example. All the memory that you put in servers are what's called registered memory. And it has, it's also ECC memory, which is error correcting memory. And what this means is that, imagine that you have several integrated circuits with the cells of memory. You have an extra one with a parity bit which is able to correct at least one bit flip. So this is actually very, very common, and it's embedded in every single device that you have in computers nowadays. Let me give you another example. In high-end servers, if you go to a company and buy a high-end server, actually the memory blocks are RAID memory blocks. So nowadays people are even doing RAID in memory. Okay? So I know it seems a little bit funny to say cosmic rays or high radiation rays, but actually we are being crossed by cosmic radiation every single day. Okay? So it's quite common for this to happen. The way normally you try to prevent some of these Byzantine failures, where you can actually have lying nodes that lie to other parties or give different information to different parties, in general, is by using checksums, okay? And error correcting codes. But again, if you have a bug in the software, if you code it wrongly, you can actually send a commit message to one of the nodes and an abort message to another one. So the two-phase commit protocol assumes that you don't have Byzantine failures. You don't have, let's say, lying nodes. Let me give you a different example of a lying node. Let's imagine that this guy actually sends a yes, but it aborts the transaction. Again, if there is a bug in the code, or a cosmic ray, or whatever, that can happen. Okay? So what we are assuming is that you don't have that kind of problems. Or if you do, you actually have checksums and things like that in place to ensure that you don't have Byzantine failures. Second assumption. You assume that you have reliable delivery of messages. What this means is that messages will eventually get across, right? The way you implement this, it's quite straightforward. You have sequence numbers, you have acknowledge backs, and basically the protocol at the low level keeps on trying sending messages until it gets through. This is implemented, for instance, in TCP/IP, at least to a certain level. Third assumption, processes do not fail forever. And this one is a hard one, right? What this means is that for this protocol to work correctly, basically you are assuming that once a node crashes, eventually, sooner or later, it will come up and it will start the application server again, and the application server is going to stable storage and look at the correct phase of the protocol. If you don't have this assumption, basically everything goes in this scenario. Okay? Fourth assumption. Actions are written to stable storage. So you need to have stable storage for it to work. Okay. Fifth assumption is that when the system restarts, you actually restart on the correct phase of the protocol. Okay? Of course, in the real world, what you try to do is to create systems that respect this in a sensible way. So, for instance, stable storage is quite commonly implemented using write disks, and you assume that you will not have a catastrophe on your server room, which sometimes happen. You assume that processes do not fail forever. Use checksums to guarantee that you don't have lying processes, and so on. Okay. Okay. Some example recovery actions. I've told you about this before. For instance, if the coordinator crashes in its initial state, it's very simple. If you have a watchdog timer in the server, it should restart the server, and basically it starts from the correct phase of the protocol. Imagine that the coordinator crashes after writing prepare into the log or into the stable storage, but before sending the can't commit message. Again, upon restarting, it will look to the stable storage and send the can't commit message. Of course, this can generate duplicates. I told you that I'm assuming reliable messaging, which means that the duplicates should be actually filtered out. Imagine that the coordinator fails while waiting for the responses. Again, after restarting, it will send the can't commit messages again and we'll get an answer, and so on and so forth. Okay? Okay. In practice, what's the biggest problem of using the two-phase commit protocol in distributed environments? One of the major problems is that when you are doing two-phase commit and you have several databases and several systems, when you have a participant, you have to lock the resources while the transaction doesn't complete. Let me give you an example. Imagine that we are in this scenario. So I told the first machine, let's take out 5,000 euros from this bank account. One way to implement this in the database is to actually lock that bank account, right? That way, if someone tries to take money out of the account, it has to wait until the transaction commits, okay? So locking is a way of ensuring that you have ACID transactions. Now let's imagine that I'm depositing the money on the second account. But again, I can only really do it after the commit. So that means that I can temporarily put the money in a log or something like that, but I have to lock that bank account in the second system, and the third system, and so on. So what happens is that for implementing this, in most cases, if you look at the number of locks associated, for instance, with databases, application servers, message queues, and so on, the number of locks is actually increasing over time because I'm using more resources on each one of the machines. I'm locking several records in different databases, right? So it has to be locked until either I commit or I abort. Of course, the problem is that this works fine for transactions that are quite fast. If a transaction takes, let's say, 10 milliseconds, in most systems is okay. Well, if I have a transaction that actually takes a day or 2 days, it's completely unacceptable. Imagine that I'm transferring 1,000 euros from my bank account to Higini's bank account. You know that in Portugal, money takes about 1-2 days to be transferred between bank accounts. I would not be very happy if I transferred the money and basically I couldn't use my account for 1 day because the account was locked until the two-phase commit protocol was completed with Higino. And the same thing with Higino. Higino would not be able to use his bank account until the transaction completed. Nor anyone else would be able to deposit money in Higino's bank account. And no one else would be able to deposit money in my account. Right? And that's the biggest problem. A two-phase commit protocol is great if I have short duration transactions of short duration. If I actually have long-running transactions, it's a nightmare. Why? Because I have to lock all the resources in place. If humans are in the loop, and actually, let's imagine that the transaction has to be approved by someone. Let's imagine that it's a credit in my bank account or something like that, and I have a human in the loop, that's even worse. Okay? Again, this is just an example from the book from Microsoft Press about understanding web services. It basically describes a scenario which is constantly a transaction. Basically, I'm buying a product somewhere and I'm enclosing this in a transaction. But actually, this transaction, this business activity, takes a month to complete. Okay? Because I'm buying something or something like that. It doesn't make sense to lock all the resources for 1 month. It doesn't work. So again, the two-phase commit protocol is great for things that are fast. Okay? But the overhead is great and it doesn't work for long-running actions. So you may ask, what's the alternative? And the alternative is what's called business activities. And what I do in a business activity is I still have transactions, but I relax one of the characteristics. And the characteristic that I relax is isolation in general. What this means is that, in general, I will allow some of the changes of a transaction to become visible to the outside world. Okay? So again, if I'm transferring $1,000 from my account to Hygienus, what happens is that this is not really atomic and isolated, let's say, because immediately I see the money disappearing from my account, the money is nowhere for some time, for almost a day, and then the money appears in Hygienus' account. Okay? As we will see in a few moments, I can still guarantee that I'm not going to lose the money and the rest of the system is consistent and so on, but I'm relaxing isolation. Things are becoming visible in the meantime. Okay? Another thing that I do when I relax isolation is in general to have what's called compensatory actions. And compensatory actions are pieces of code that are activated when something goes wrong. And the idea behind this is that I have what's called optimistic concurrency control. I assume that things are going to be okay. Of course, I need to have some assurances, but I assume that things are going to be okay. If things go wrong, I somehow have a mechanism to solve it either online or offline. I have a procedure for that. Okay? Let me give you an example. Imagine that I'm doing a two-phase commit. I'm transferring money between two bank accounts. In this case, I would start a transaction. So I would have a begin transaction here. I would take the money out of this account, transfer to the other account, do the credit, and finally do the commit. If this takes 2 days, I'll be virtually blocking the two accounts for 2 days or 1 day, right? So what people do in practice is that, let's assume that I have a message queue. We've talked a little bit about message queues. A message queue has stable storage associated to it. So whenever I get a message and I write it to stable storage, I'm assured that the message will not get lost. And what I do is something like this. I start a transaction and I take the money out of the first bank account. And I send the message to this message queue. When I do a commit, basically, if the commit succeeds, I'm assured that the message was written into this transactional message queue. Okay? The message it's like a check or a piece of money is actually in that queue. Okay? So I have a transaction between the bank and that message queue. Notice that this transaction is still atomic. Either it completes or it doesn't complete. Either I have the money in the account or I have the token in the message queue. It's consistent with itself because either the money, again, it depends on the programmer not trying to defraud the bank, but either the money is in the bank account or is in a message in a piece of paper represented in a message queue. Is it isolated? As a whole, no, because this change is going to be visible. The money is going to disappear from the bank. And it's durable. Yes, because I have stable storage in the first point and stable storage on the message queue. What's going to happen then is that I have a second transaction. And in the second transaction, I start a transaction on the second bank account. I read the message, I credit the amount, and I commit. Let's imagine that the system crashes at this point. If the system crashes, this transaction is rolled back and the money is still in this message queue, right? If the system crashes here, it's the same thing. If the transaction commits, well, the message disappeared from the message queue and it was atomically committed to the database. Okay? So I'm relaxing isolation. Let me give you an example of a compensatory action. Imagine that I have the same scenario, but actually the credit fails somehow. I could associate a piece of code which I would call a compensatory action, and the compensatory action in this case could be as simple as writing the message back to a queue to credit it back on the first bank account, and I would commit. Of course, this becomes seriously complicated because imagine that in the meanwhile, the first bank account was erased. Well, the compensatory action itself would fail, right? So in general, when designing compensatory actions, I should actually strive for simplicity, and it's very, very common to actually put a human in the loop. So it's quite common not to do this kind of, let's say, automatic recovery procedures and to actually put these kind of transactions in a special queue or something like that. That has to be solved by the bank manager or someone, okay? That's very, very common. I have had many phone calls from my bank manager because either I did something strange and I didn't have money in the account, or this actually happened to me once where I asked for a bank account to be closed in a situation quite similar to this one before they actually completed the transaction, and the money stayed in a limbo and they didn't know what to do with the money then. So these kind of things are actually common. Okay? Okay. What about transaction monitors? This may look very abstract, but I can assure you that I'm a very practical guy. So the things that I'm showing you are actually implemented in practice in application servers and in software. So the transaction monitor, that coordinator that I told you about, it's what's called a TP monitor, okay? And there's an industry standard that is used by everyone called XA, or XOpenDTP, which is basically the protocol that every single database and every single application server and every single message queue implements when they want to be transactional. So if I start JBoss right now, okay, you will believe me. It actually, if you look at I don't want to start JBoss right now. If you look at the log messages, you will actually see GTS, Java Transaction System, coming up, and GTS actually implements XA, okay? If you look at an Oracle database and the logs, Oracle actually implements this protocol. The same thing with BIA Tuxedo, the same thing with Microsoft, and so on and so forth. So the transaction monitor is basically a small application server which is the coordinator of transactions, and it acts on behalf of clients and participants. Participants, again, can be databases or any kind of resources that implement a transactional protocol. For give you a small idea of what's involved, you have operations to, for instance, open a connection to the transaction monitor, close the transaction, start a new transaction, do a rollback, do a prepare, do commit, recover, and so on. Okay? It's not very important. The important thing is for you to know that this protocol exists and it's implemented. Can you see this? Not really. I will make it larger in a moment. How many of you know TPC, and in particular TPCC? Okay, one person. Anyone on that side? Pittsburgh guys? TPC. Okay. TPC is the Transaction Processing Performance Console, and it's a body that basically standardizes benchmarks in general for databases, but also web applications, data warehousing, and so on. So whenever people want to measure the performance of a database or a web application, in general, they use something like TPC-C, which is a benchmark. TPC-C is for normal debit-credit kind of operations, so it's a transactional benchmark. If you go to TPC-H, is for data warehousing. If you go to TPC-W, is for web applications, and so on. And for instance, these are basically this is not a good way of showing you this. But, no, that was odd. So, for instance, the results are a little bit dated, but you can see the first result in this case was from HP using a Superdome Titanium 2 server, and they had a bunch of metrics regarding the performance of the system. But the interesting point is are these ones. In this case, they are using Oracle. But again, for being able to achieve this kind of performances, you have to put several Oracle databases in a cluster, which means that you actually have to have a transactional monitor in place, okay, if you want to have transactions between the clients and the servers. So in this case, the Oracle database is actually using a TP monitor, which is called Tuxedo, which was actually a product from BIA, and BIA was bought some time ago by Oracle, I think. If you look at the second result, it's actually IBM DB2, which is a very common database also. But the TP monitor they are using is actually Microsoft Complez. So Microsoft servers actually come with a transactional monitor embedded in the operating system itself. Again, third result is also DB2. You can look at, for instance, Microsoft SQL Server. In this case, again, is using Microsoft Complez, and so on and so forth. Okay? So you can have a transactional monitor from one manufacturer and a database or several databases from other suppliers of software. Okay. Okay. Questions so far? No questions? Okay, let's talk a little bit more about isolation. This is actually a very important topic, and it's one that hopefully it will surprise you. How many of you normally use databases and so on? Off, maybe? Do you think your transactions in a database are ACID? Is the semantics of the database ACID? Atomic, consistent, isolated, and durable? Do you think your transactions are atomic?
Yeah.
Do you think they are isolated? So? It depends. Okay. Miguel?
Actually, I'm thinking about a data warehouse where you're inserting on a table and selecting at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
What Oracle usually does is creates a copy of the table and selects on that table while the inserts are being processed. So
doesn't that sound strange? Because supposedly you have isolation. That's what everyone tells you in a database course, right?
Yeah. In terms of the user, it doesn't see anything happening backstage. But if
that's what you think, okay.
But no.
Okay.
There are several million records. You see it because it doesn't complete, and the machine isn't able to successfully perform the operations.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about this, because for me this was, when I learned about this the first time, it was really mind-blowing, because in my database course, when I did it several years ago, the professor was really like, databases are ACID and transactions are great, and if you do begin transaction, end transaction, and put things in the middle, you don't have any kind of problem. Well, it doesn't work really that way. So let's talk a little bit about isolation. And when you talk about isolation, in general, you have three different phenomena, three possible phenomena. You can have what's called dirty reads. So imagine that you are relaxing isolation somehow, or your database is not implementing ACID transactions. A dirty read is basically when a transaction is able to read uncommitted data from a different transaction. Okay? So imagine that I have, okay, forget this drawing, but imagine that I have start transaction, okay? And I have a different transaction and I do start transaction. And this one actually changes a certain record, and this guy actually does a select regarding that table. If this guy is able to read something that this guy changed before the starting of the transaction, that's a DRA. That's a dirty read, okay? If I'm able to read data that was actually uncommitted by another transaction, okay? The second phenomenon that can happen, which is a different one, is what's called an unrepeatable read. And an unrepeatable read is when, if you read the data several times, the data is not guaranteed to look the same, okay? So imagine you do a select, you get a result inside of a transaction, and inside your same transaction, you do exactly the same select, and you get a different result. This should be forbidden if you have an ACID transaction. Why? Because you should be able to see the world as a constant if you are inside of a transaction. Phantom reads. This is the third phenomenon. A phantom read is when you have a select and you are actually able to see records being introduced in a table. A little bit like what Miguel was saying. So imagine that you are doing something like select count star from emp, okay, inside of a transaction, and you get, let's say, 1,000 records. And after a while, you do a select count star from emp, and you have 1,020 records, okay? Basically, if you look at each one of the records, can actually become visible. It's like you have phantoms sneaking in and out of the tables, okay? Again, if you really have ACID transactions, you shouldn't have phantom reads, okay? Okay. The way normally people try to prevent these phenomena is by using different types of locks. Again, this is quite complicated in detail. I'm not going into detail regarding this, but at least you get a sense of the kind of things the database does behind the scenes. If you want to know a lot about this, again, go to that database book. It has 3 or 4 chapters only about this. But the most basic things that you have, it's what's called read locks. And what this means is that if you are in a transaction and you are going to access a certain record in a table, you can put a lock on it, okay, once you read. And that means that you never get non-repeatable reads. Why? Because it's locked and basically it stays constant. The second kind of locks that you can have, it's locks for updates, just updates. And that kind of locks, it's what's called a write lock. A write lock is used whenever you are in a transaction and you are actually updating a certain record on a table. And you can put a write lock on it. If you put a write lock on it, it means that only you can change the data, okay? So if only you can change the data, basically you are protecting the access to the data. But notice that even so, if you just use a write lock, you can have a dirty read. Why? Because you change the data, you move it from 10 to 20, well, the other guys can actually read the 10 or the 20 if you are not protecting the system somehow. And you can actually have non-repeatable reads because you are doing updates, you are the only one who can do it. But again, if you are changing it, the other guys can read it and see different values over time. And you have exclusive write locks. Exclusive write locks is basically saying, I'm writing to this record, but I'm the only one who can actually write to this record, and I'm the only one who has it locked. What this means is that if other guys actually try to read it, they will be blocked until your transaction actually completes. Okay? Again, this gets a little bit more complicated, and it doesn't solve all the problems in a straight way.
You also have different granularities for locks. For example, if you lock a table, you prevent the phantom.
Again, you can lock at the record level, you can lock at the table level. And let me tell you that nowadays, in many cases, you don't fully lock during a transaction. So databases are doing more sophisticated things than this. But again, these are just core concepts. The thing that I want you to know about is basically these 4 concepts. If you look at the SQL standard, and if you actually look at application servers, whenever you specify an isolation level, you can go to a database and actually write set isolation. Well, it's not like this, but it's almost like this. Set isolation level to something, okay? And you can do the same in a J2EE server, okay? You can configure the isolation level. And there are 4 different isolation levels. You can configure it to read and committed. Read and committed is basically everything goes. Okay? So basically, if you put a table or transactions in read and committed, you can have dirty reads, non-repeatable reads, phantom reads. Okay? And you say, why should I want to do this? This is crazy. Well, sometimes it's okay. So imagine that you have a table that is not normally updated. Okay? It's like a lookup table or something like that for postal codes in the country or whatever. It's not really updated very often, and it's basically used to read or something like that. If you actually put read and committed, what this means is that you are not doing any kind of locking over that table, which means that the performance, you actually get a performance boost with it, okay? Because you don't have to do any locking. The database is actually not doing much on your behalf. The second level is read committed. And what this means is that only committed data can be read by a transaction. So imagine that I have two transactions, and the first one is actually reading data. The data it sees is the data before the beginning of the transaction. Okay? So you have only committed data being read. Repeatable read is the third. Of course, in this second level, you can still have non-repeatable reads and phantom reads. For instance, how can you have a non-repeatable read? Imagine that you have a transaction and you actually do a select over a database table. Okay? What you see is the data before the commit, but imagine that the second transaction commits and updates the table, right? If you do the same select again, what you are going to see is basically the result of the second commit inside of your transaction. Okay? So the data that you are reading was actually committed, and you are getting the last snapshot of the committed data. Okay? But of course, you can have non-repeatable reads. Why? Because if other guys are changing the table, if you do several selects, you are going to see the different snapshots. Phantom reads, of course, because if you are adding records to a database table, you are going to see those extra records coming in. Repeatable reads. What this means is that every time you do a select, you always get the same data. Okay? So again, if you have a transaction, if you do several selects, you always get the data as it was in the beginning of the transaction. Okay? Finally, serializable. What's serializable? This is what you normally call ACID transactions. So basically, you don't have dirty reads, you don't have non-repeatable reads, you don't have phantom reads. And to implement this, you actually need heavy locking. What? So phantom reads is, imagine that you have a table with 100 records. If someone else introduces extra records in the table, they become visible. Okay? So imagine that you have, let me give you an example. Let's imagine a table with 3 records. Okay? And imagine that you have a transaction that reads these records. If you have repeatable reads, the data inside of these 3 records will not change, even if other transactions try to change, let's say 1 to 2 in one of the records, okay?
So I don't understand why phantom reads can occur in repeatable read.
Because the repeatable read, it's at the row level, let's say. So the rows don't change, but if you get extra rows in the table, they become visible, okay? So again, phantom reads is for the number of records in the table. The repeatable reads is for the individual records in a sense. Okay? Serializable. To implement serializable transactions, basically you are doing heavy locking, you are doing locking at the table level, at the record level, and it's quite heavy. And this is the kind of semantics that people normally teach you in the database courses. Why is this interesting? This is interesting because if you look at the documentation of databases, all, if not all, the databases are not using serializable transactions. Actually, because of performance, in general, they are configured, for instance, in read committed. What this means is that, for instance, you can have phantom reads, okay? And you can have in this case, read committed. In the case of, I was showing you Oracle. So they are in read committed, right? Which means that if you are using an Oracle database, you can have non-repeatable reads, okay? So if you are doing a query and you are inside of a transaction and the records change twice inside of your transaction and committed, you will see the changes, and extra records in tables will show up in your transaction. And this is the default isolation level, okay? This is what happens if you are using an Oracle database. If you look at Postgre, which is also widely used, basically they actually only implement 2 isolation levels. Although the standard says there are 4 isolation levels, they just implement 2 of them. And for the least strict one, they use the most strict one. And the default isolation level in Postgre is, again, read committed. This is from the documentation of Postgre. This means that in their case, you cannot have dirty reads. That's your basic assumption. But again, you can have non-repeatable reads and phantom reads. Okay? Okay. Okay. Is this clear? So you really need to be careful when designing these systems and implementing these systems. Okay? Okay, transactions in Java. Basically, the transaction monitor is implemented in something called GTS. GTS is basically an interface that implements that standard, and it's a wrapper to Java. Any application server nowadays, JBoss, Glassfish, WebLogic, and so on, actually has a GTS implemented. Of course, you can use external transaction servers in Java. The API in itself, it's called GTA, Java Transaction API. So I just want you to know that, again, if you have an application server with an application and use a transaction monitor, the class being used is something called Transaction Manager. The transactions themselves, when you do begin transaction, it's part of a user transaction. I don't know if you've seen this on the second assignment, but sometimes in the samples you'd see begin transaction, commit, and some of you may have opted to actually do it. Notice that transactions are completely generic. It doesn't have to do with databases. It can be anything as long as you are able to commit and roll back. And this means that actually the resources use a different class that implements the API, but the application and the end resources actually use a specific protocol. So if you are talking about databases, you are using JBD. That's wrongly spelled, I think. If you are using different kind of resources like message queues, you are using a different protocol behind the scenes, okay? Okay, so you've seen this in the second assignment. In J2EE, you have session beans, and you have objects that represent records in the database. the thing that I want to show you is that whenever you have this kind of application servers, you can have two different types of transactions. You can have what's called container managed transactions. So the container, the application server, takes care of starting transactions, committing transactions, and so on. For instance, when you do entity manager .persist something, if it's container manager managed, it will take care of the transactions. Probably some of you got some exceptions regarding this if you configured wrongly the entity manager and the persistent unit. That's quite common. But you can also manage it by hand. And this is very handy if you actually have to perform several invocations to methods and want a finer grain of control. If you are using container managed transactions, basically you have annotations that you put in methods. Okay? So whenever you have a method on a session bin, basically you put a small annotation. Okay? And there are several possible annotations. The first one is required. Okay? What this means is that if you have a client, imagine, Higino is my application server with a method. I'm a client and I'm using J2EE. I'm going to call a method. Okay? Imagine that I don't have any transaction. Okay? I'm just doing a call in my application. If I don't have a transaction and Higino put an annotation in the method saying required, what happens is that the container automatically creates a transaction for the whole method. Okay? So if there is an exception in the middle of the method, everything is rolled back. So there is no changes to the databases, to the resources involved between those two calls. Okay? Required means that you always need to have a transaction to execute that method. If I actually had a transaction going on, if in my application I had done begin transaction and I was doing something with that transaction, when I call the method, basically the transaction ID is propagated to Higino, to his method, which means that if there is an exception there, everything is rolled back until the beginning of my transaction, which may actually involve different partners. Okay? Requires new. That's the second annotation that I can use in a J2EE server. If I do requires new, basically every time I call a method on Higino, Higino starts a new transaction. Okay? What this means is that, let's assume that I didn't have any transaction. When I call his method, he begins a transaction. If he gets an exception or rolls back, everything up to the beginning of the method body is rolled back. Okay? Let's imagine that I had a transaction going on. What happens? Because he began a transaction on his own, it's only rolled back until the beginning of the method, and I'm left at the state where basically I was about to call it. Again, depending on how it's implemented, I can either roll back everything or try to invoke it again or do something different. Mandatory. It's the third kind of annotation that I can have. What this means is that Higino requires a transaction to be in place. So if I don't have a transaction and I call his method, he's going to throw me an exception and say, listen, you have to have a transaction or I'm not going to talk with you. Okay? If I had a transaction created, then it's okay and he processes whatever he needs to process. Not supported. Not supported is an annotation that Higino can put on his method, and what this means is that I don't know how to use transactions. Okay? So I'm not using transactions. So if I had no transaction going on, okay, I don't get a transaction. If I have a transaction going on, Higino is going to execute the method, but if he gets an exception, he's not making any promises. Whatever it happens is whatever it happens. It's my problem. Supports means that if I don't have a transaction, Eugenio is not going to create one for me. He's assuming that I don't want to be transactional. If I actually have a transaction going on, Eugenio will use my transaction. Never means that Eugenio will never use a transaction. So, if I don't have a transaction going on, Eugenio is willing to execute the method and everything goes well. If I have a transaction, Eugenio is going to throw me an exception saying, I'm not dealing with you, I'm not transactional. Okay? And again, if you properly annotate your container, and if you properly annotate your methods with these annotations, in general, you can do a lot of work without having to actually develop code by hand to manage transactions. Of course, you need to know what these things mean.
When methods say they support transactions, do they have to receive the transaction as a parameter or the container?
It's automatic. So basically, this application server is talking with the application server on the other side, and it automatically passes the ID to the other side. So imagine that inside your method you are using a database, and you say supports. Basically, when I call your method and you use the beans to use the database, behind the scenes, the transaction ID on the client side is also being passed to the database. Okay? This is why you don't have to do almost anything, because what you are actually doing with these attributes is kind of specifying what you want to happen to the IDs of the transactions, if you want them to be propagated or not, or if you want to throw an exception if you don't support transactions. Okay? It's quite handy. Okay? So this is a description of what I basically said.
But the rollback is only done if you throw an exception, not if you return an error code specifically.
Yeah, for it to know what's going on, you need to throw an exception. Of course, you don't need to use annotations, and sometimes you need a finer grain of control. If you want to do that in J2EE, basically, you have the context manager for your container. You can say, get user transaction. There's a class called user transaction, and basically using this user transaction, you can say, begin transaction, take money out of this account, put money in this account, commit, roll back, and so on. Okay? So you can either use annotations to try to do these things, or sometimes if you have a very long method, or you need to do things in more detail inside of a method, then you want to control the transaction by hand. Okay?
If the transfer money is called already within a transaction, does the begin attach to existing transaction? Or
there are methods to actually do that also. So you need to look at the documentation. And you can combine transactions and things like that. Okay? So again, the key point is that you can have container-managed transactions or user-managed transactions. And also you need to be careful about the isolation levels, because sooner or later, they will surprise you. Okay, if you want to learn more about this, about distributed transactions in particular, read chapter 14 of the Colores book. If you want to know more about Corb and a lot of information about transactions and transaction monitors and so on, there's a book that is, as you can see, a little bit dated. It's from 1999. Although, again, these things were developed a long time ago, and it has quite a nice description on chapter 15 to 18. Have you ever heard about this book, the Orfoley book, and the Orfoley books? It's actually a funny story, because these guys they said, computer science books are so boring. So they decided to start to write books for computer scientists, quite serious books, but basically using aliens and explaining things in terms of aliens and these characters in the book. So it's kind of a strange situation where you are reading a booklet that looks a little bit like a cartoon book, but at the same time is talking about transaction monitors and persistence and Corb and so on. So I advise you to take a look at it. And the book that I recommend for the second assignment, there's a chapter which is chapter 16, which has quite a few details regarding transactions from a J2E point of view. Questions? No questions, guys? Okay, let's go. See you next week.